which considers as typical, has shown a 673% increase in volunteers since the period 2013 to 2019, which equates to actually an increase of 1,467 new volunteers within that period. In terms of adapting to climate change, there were 31 projects that contributed to sustainable flood management through restoration of floodplain, provision of flood storage, culvert and weir removal. And as a consequence, it was modelled that a minimum of 1,661 properties had reduced flood risk as a result of river restoration. But river restoration is also important for enabling habitats and species to adapt to climate change pressures by enabling species to survive both extreme events by creating refugia, but also to increase recolonisation by removing blockages for wildlife. And finally, there's the potential that wetlands can also assist in carbon offsetting through the creation of wetlands, which is a very important habitat for carbon sequestration. So in terms of looking at the figures, approximately 39 kilometres of river was restored between the period of 2000 to 2019, which represented approximately 6.5% of the total of non-tidal river in London. The length of river restored met the London plan targets of 15 kilometres by 2015 and 25 kilometres by 2020. However, since 2010, the length of river restored per year has remained constant, with on average just below 3 kilometres restored per year. A continuation of this rate of delivery would result in just over 20% of length of river restored by 2050, which is very much why we had the call from Seaport that actually we should be seeking an increase in the delivery of these projects. So why has we had this plateauing? Well, delivery in terms of focusing on wildlife has increased. However, there has been a decline in schemes which were focused on delivering flood and wider societal benefits, such as access to nature and trying to resolve other environmental inequalities. This reflects the challenge for project proposals to meet criteria of funding streams and the difficulty in aligning funding streams to deliver multiple benefit projects. It is also likely to reflect the difficulties in quantifying the flood risk and societal benefits of small schemes at both a project and catchment level. There is also an issue around revenue and availability of refurbishing schemes. Whoops, wrong way. So, to deliver the challenge of meeting a minimum of 5 kilometres per year, increased investment is essential to deliver that target. This will require community support to be strengthened, new partnerships to be established, and new sources of investment to be found. For London Rivers Week 2021, an opportunities map has been produced that identifies at least 145 sites where restoration can take place, which covers a minimum of 38 kilometres. This data has been produced using knowledge from the catchment partnerships and catchment plans. The focus has been on improving wildlife habitat, which is always a core aspect of this work. However, it is clear these opportunities can also deliver a wider range of environmental, societal, and economic benefits. It is hoped that this will be a launchpad to highlight practical opportunities and call for river restoration funding from sectors ranging from boroughs, developers, health and welfare sectors. The aim is to widen the pool of funders past the usual environmental sector, as society not only emerges from the isolation of the COVID-19 pandemic, but urgently seeks to address the climate change pressures through building resilience in nature. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. That was a really useful introduction, scene-setting presentation there, and I think a great tribute to the work of many organisations and individuals in terms of achieving the restoration rates that we've seen over the last 2 decades, and a great call to arms, really, to increase that rate moving forward. And it's great to see that map, which I think is available just for the first time, isn't it, in public? So we'll share that more widely, I'm sure. Brilliant. A great start. I'm going to hand over now, though, to Matthew Thrift from the London Wildlife Trust, who will be known, I'm sure, to many of you. Matthew has 30 years or more of experience of working in the urban nature world, and London Wildlife Trust, in particular, has done an awful amount of very good work in recent years to restore wetlands and waterways. So over to you, Matthew, to tell us a bit about how this can help wildlife and people.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Dave. And good afternoon, everybody. I presume you can see my screen. Is that a yes?
Yep, we can. Yep.
Good stuff. I'm just going to give a very brief overview of why wetlands and waterways are called for wildlife. I presume many on the call that this is a no-brainer, but it's just a reminder that we share our city with a very great diversity of species. Now I'm just trying to make my screen move. A little background about London Wildlife Trust. We're in our 40th year. We work across London. We've worked in every London borough over those 40 years, but at this current moment in time, we are focusing in probably about 8 or 9 boroughs, and we cover all habitats from buildings right through to ancient woodland, including canals, reservoirs, and lakes and ponds. We have, as a city, made great changes and great improvements, possibly against what many of us might believe from what we hear in the media, but also from the kind of extinction crisis that much of the world is suffering. If we think of London very specifically, this rather famous image on the left here is of Bill Brandt's picture of a black-headed gull swimming through the Port of London in about 1930s, when the River Thames was biologically dead, and there was a lot of pollution covering the city, and we believe the biodiversity was actually in a far worse state than it is today, although we have to take account of the fact that there has been significant changes in land use since that time. From the database that Giggle holds, Green Space Information for Greater London, we share the city with about 16,000 species of plants, animals, and fungi. Many of those are brief visitors, seasonal visitors, rarities, and vagrants, as I know, but many, many more are resident in this city. And the work of London Wildlife Trust and many of our partners on the call today, but elsewhere, are working to conserve this biodiversity either directly or indirectly. Only 2% of London is wet or blue, but of course this hides the immense kind of network of rivers, streams, canals and ditches, which collectively have 1,600 kilometres and 1,800 hectares of open water. And of course the real wealth and the significance of wetland habitats, whether they're standing or flowing water, is that they offer this kind of conjunction between the land and the water itself, which provides a great richness of habitat diversity, which is exploited by a range of species. So if we think of things like kingfishers, which Dave mentioned, they nest in burrows and riverbanks, but they fish in rivers. So that we need good quality rivers to support them, but also good quality river habitats adjacent to those water bodies to enable them to fulfill their life cycle. And that goes for a range of other species. We mustn't also forget that perhaps ironically, London is actually nationally important for some species, particularly in terms of the open water bodies such as the reservoirs up in the Lee Valley and onto the southwest of Heathrow Airport. They're internationally important for birds like pochard here, but also shoveler, tufted duck, gadwall, etc. And from the perspective of London Wildlife Trust and many of our partners, the conservation priorities are what drives a lot of our work. So whether it's water voles, shoveler, world milfoil, here an aquatic plant, or European eel, these are things which kind of frame our work on rivers and waterways across London. And much of this is actually, Dave was talking about looking forward, but we have to remember there was a lot of context established about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, with the Biodiversity Action Plan process, and developing a range of habitat and species action plans, which basically identified the priorities for conserving the species which were of importance, and also the actions that would take place. And those are the kind of London plans which were then interpreted at a more local level through most London boroughs. Not every London borough has produced a biodiversity action plan. I won't name the two that haven't, but gives you an idea that a lot of work has already been undertaken. And as Dave indicated in his maps and graphs, a lot of that has been driven by concerns for enhancing rivers and waterways for biodiversity. Although I think it's safe to say that the work from London Wildlife Trust perspective is that it's implicitly the work that we do for biodiversity is good for people. Yeah, we are well aware of the benefits that a high quality natural environment provides for our mental and physical well-being, and the work that the Trust does is very much based on this purpose, driven by a policy that was established 25 years ago, 35 years ago, which is about providing access to nature and reducing the areas of deficiency of that access to nature across the capital. And I think a signifier of the species that has kind of benefited from so much of the work that's been undertaken over the last 6 decades or so is the grey heron. In 1949, one of the esteemed biologists of the 20th century, Richard Fitter, said it can be asserted with a fair degree of certainty that neither the heron nor the spoonbill will ever again breed in London outside the zoo. Now, 1% of the grey heron's population in the UK was found in London in 1985, and you can go and see the 5th largest grey heronry at Walthamstow Wetlands. To give you an example of how a species has benefited from the sort of accumulative work of cleaning up our rivers. A lot of the work that we do, as I said, is intimately and integrated with this access to nature. So here's a view of River Crane with a school group doing river dipping. And we involve many people in our work, whether it's here cutting reeds to benefit reed warbler habitat. And if we can't use volunteers, or we need to do something a little bit more profound, then we resort to machinery. Here, reed cutting a meander on the River Crane. And these are the kind of actions which I'm sure will be spelled out by following presentations on the kind of actions that we do here. And this is on the Yedding Brook, to try and introduce a more varied morphology into the river, which brings about benefits for fish, and aquatic invertebrates and aquatic plants. The benefit species such as this, the bullhead, which is a conservation priority in London. We can also involve volunteers through creating new reed beds, and this is on the River Brent in Brent River Park, showing how a much more previously canalised and fairly boring from a biodiversity perspective river profile has been changed by actively moving the bank, extending it outwards, and that creates changes and swirls in the river water corridor, and that improves benefits for biodiversity. Another example here, this is linked also to flood storage. This is at Oak Hill Park in East Barnet on the Pims Brook, adjacent to one of the Trust nature reserves, where we effectively brought up to the surface a tunnelled culvert and linked that to the Pims Brook, which does flood very much in winter. And this is an example of this is a photograph of a year after we've undertaken that work. And you can see it's already been colonised by plants. We've got a grey heron there in the background, already looking for fish. Doubtful that we've found that far up, but anyway, this is an example which has been carried out across London by many organisations. And then two pieces of work that we've undertaken in the last few years are focused on reservoirs. Stoke Newington East Reservoir up near Manor House on the Haringey-Hackney borders, reprofiled in 2014-15 and reopened opened to the public for the first time in 2016 as Woodbury Wetlands. And then a little bit further east in the Lee Valley, working with Thames Water and Waltham Forest Council, we have opened and are currently now delivering a whole range of activities at Walthamstow Wetlands, which is a kind of rebranded of the 10 reservoirs that occupy 211 hectares in the mid-Lee Valley. A lot of our work here is monitoring the bird populations. It's an internationally important site. It was the first site that little egret, for example, bred in London. But it's not just birds and kind of fluffy mammals. We're also particularly interested in molluscs. Two rare molluscs live on the Thames foreshores in Chiswick, Isleworth and Brentford, one of which is the German hairy snail, which is here being handled by the Mayor of Hounslow back in 2014. The other is a tulip door snail. And we've got their numbers declining for reasons that we don't know, but we think are suspected to do with clear-ups of litter along the strand line, because these molluscs actually graze the algae that sort of accumulates on plastic debris that's washed up on the shore. So we just need to be mindful when we're undertaking river cleanups that we're not destroying important biodiversity en route, and there's a dialogue there to be had. But a lot of our work is actually sort of monitoring the status of these species at key sites in that part of London. And then there are things that surprise us. I don't know if I can play this video, but I'm sure you can see what these are. Now, as you can imagine, this is European otter. It has returned to London. This is somewhere in the Lee Valley. I'm not going to give you the precise location, but it gives you an example again of the opportunities that biodiversity, that wildlife, that nature will exploit once we give them space and the conditions to do so. This mammal was persecuted and kind of shut out of London because of the pollution and the severance to habitats that we'd undertaken from the 50s onwards. It has now returned on its own accord, at least in two parts of London. And then, as I'm sure might be mentioned later this lunchtime, is the kind of great waterway engineer, which the Wildlife Trusts have been working on now for about 20 years. You've heard a lot probably about the work in Devon and our fellow Devon Wildlife Trust with the University of Exeter and other organisations on the family that was kind of wild on the River Otter. But also the work of Kent, Cheshire and Derbyshire Wildlife Trusts, as well as those in Scotland, looking at the feasibility of reintroducing beaver into the London area. I personally have doubts whether it will truly become wild, but there are certainly opportunities for them to be piloted to see whether they can really change catchments. The surveys that will be carried out so far and the research undertaken in Devon has shown they bring about amazing benefits for biodiversity, for climate resilience, for water quality, and of course there is that kind of cuddly feel that was brought about tourism benefits to certain parts of Devon. So last but not least, I just want to kind of reassure everybody that it's not just about the wildlife, it is about making sure we don't lose connection with the natural world that lives in and around us, and that the work of the Trust and of many other organisations is helping to bring the wetland biodiversity close to where people live, work and play. And to me, a test of whether we have reached that is that every small boy is prepared to put a leech on their face. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew. Fantastic overview of the wildlife benefits of wetland restoration and river restoration. I'm sure that you'll have lots of questions. We've got a few in the Q&A panel already, but please keep them coming. We'll come to them once we finish the presentations. Moving swiftly on, next up is Petra Davis, who works for the Southeast Rivers Trust as a senior catchment advisor. Previously worked at the London Wildlife Trust. But Petra, you're going to tell us a bit about the work you're doing with the Rivers Trust and the catchment management approach to river management and restoration.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Neil. And hello, everybody. Let me just find my screen. So I will give you a catchment perspective on river restoration in London. Here is just a very short and brief introduction to Southeast Rivers Trust. We are a very small team who is working to improve ecological condition of rivers in southeast of England, and these are catchments in which we are working. So in London, we focus on 3 rivers or 3 catchments, which are Wandle, Beverley Brook, and Hogsmill. So as part of my role, I am hosting the Wandle Catchment Partnership, which is something that I started just a few months ago, but I've been involved in projects on Wandle ever since I started working with London Wildlife Trust, so quite a while ago. So this is one of the first catchment partnerships in London that actually tried to develop a comprehensive catchment plan, which was finally achieved in 2014 after several years of intense efforts. It's a very thick document. The main body of text is close to 200 pages, which is then followed by appendices with comprehensive project list and actions list. And this catchment plan really benefited from input from a whole range of partners, some of which had knowledge and experience of functioning of the river corridor. But a lot of the organizations that contributed actually had much wider understanding of functioning of habitats and ecosystems on landscape scale, as well as expertise in engagement, education, and recruitment of volunteers. So this made this catchment plan really unique. The map on the left, on the right, actually shows a series of projects which were delivered or are ongoing as a result of their inclusion in the catchment plan. And this is very, very rough representation based on the project list on the plan, and different colors on the map actually show projects delivered by different partners. So it kind of demonstrates variety of partners who are participating in delivery on the river. I will give you just a really, really brief snapshot of type of projects that are being delivered, and obviously there will be a lot of focus on the work that Southeast Rivers Trust was doing. Unfortunately, I didn't have a chance to participate in those projects because most of them were delivered before I joined the organization. But if you have any questions, I will do my best to point you in the right direction. So the catchment plan had to deal with very typical urban issues that affect most of our rivers, which are fly tipping, littering, pollution, barriers, which are longitudinal, meaning that there is no connectivity for fish and other aquatic animals, but also there is no connectivity between the river and the floodplain and the wider ecosystem. There is also massive amount of physical modifications in the channel and lack of functional habitat and lack of management of surrounding spaces. So the solution to this wide range of issues can range from very simple ones, such as litter picking, to much more complex ones, such as technical fish passes and large-scale restoration projects. Sometimes those should span across boundaries of local authorities, so partnership work is the only way to deliver this kind of projects. So obviously, everybody will always start with low-lying fruit and easy wins. So the Southeast Rivers Trust started delivering river restoration projects in the upper reaches of River Wandle. This was relatively straightforward because the landowners were supportive, but we were always restricted by the surrounding areas and use of land along the river channel. So this is an example of habitat creation in over-widened and very shallow stretch along Carl Schulten. So brush berms, side berms, some wood debris, introduced gravel created over 2 kilometers of nice functioning habitat. So this was completed in 2015. The project also included removal of some fish barriers. This is in Whole Place, and then Butt Hill. This is technical fish pass. Moving downstream in Hackbridge, the project included easement of barriers to fish movement. So there's some serious machinery being involved. Then river channel was reprofiled, and volunteers helped with massive effort, planting around 6,000 flag plants. And this is how the area looked after, much nicer than it was before. In 2017, this project was actually expanded when section of river was adopted by a group of volunteers who scoped, designed, planned, and delivered the river restoration project that was finished in 2006. So that was Dale Park, just downstream from the bridge you saw before. Further sites include Ravensburg Park, where the back channel was renaturalized. And then finally in 2020, so this happened in February 2020, some in-channel interventions were delivered in Morden Hall Park by a group of very frozen volunteers. I think it was even snowing on some of the days. Now, all this work that I presented so far was made possible by close collaboration with landowners and land managers, and source of massive amount of funding from places such as Environment Agency, DEFRA, Thames Water, landfill funds, Heritage Lottery Fund. But one thing that actually allowed much wider range of projects being delivered, particularly on lower reaches of Wandle, is the fact that the catchment plan has been recognized in planning system. So local authorities included specific reference to Wandle catchment plan in local plans that happen in Sutton, for example, and required that developments that are close to river actually implement some of the actions identified in the catchment plan. So this, for example, happened at Corbett Close in Sutton, where a section of river, which was heavily channelized with concrete banks, was renaturalized by development. So I don't have a picture with massive amount of concrete that was pulled out of the river, but it looks much nicer. It's just been finished earlier this year. And the Environment Agency and Southeast River Trust had quite a big influence on those plans. Another bright example is further downstream in Wandsworth, where Ranbury Quarter is good practice example how river restoration can be included in projects that are focused on very urbanized, very channelized sections of river, which look like there isn't all that much that can be done. Wandsworth is, local London Borough of Wandsworth is another example where river restoration is specifically mentioned in local plans, and some of the emerging local master plans are actually referencing catchment partnership as one of the consultees during the process. So this is how Ranbury site looks like. So it was just a concrete channel with steep banks. And another bright example, again, in Wandsworth is Half Tide Weir, which was removed. I can't remember the exact date, but Val will definitely be able to tell you. So this is how it looked like before the removal. Massive amount of funding has been sourced through several development projects, and the weir has been removed after all the contaminated silt was removed. And this is the view from mouth of Pond towards Thames now. So this is definitely one of the benefits of having a strong catchment plan and doing sufficient amount of preparation work in advance to have plans that are suitable actually for inclusion in local plans. And I would say the main benefit of working on catchment scale and working with large number of partners is ability to deliver this kind of large and complex projects, which wouldn't be possible to deliver if there was only one organization working with that. So I will leave you with this nice view.
Thank you very much, Petra. Really interesting to get a catchment perspective on this question, this issue, and I'm particularly interested in your point about links with the planning system, because I think there's a lot of potential, as you say, to strengthen those links and to bring more investment into river restoration through linking it with planning and development decisions. Okay, from South London to North London now, we have two more presentations before we come to Q&A. Next up is John Miles, who's going to give us a community view from Haringey. John has been convener of the Haringey Rivers Forum for some time and is a resident of Wood Green in Haringey. So, John, I think you're going to give us a slightly different perspective on this question from the point of view of your work in Haringey. Over to you.
Yes, thanks very much, Neil. Am I audible?
Yep, you're
right.
You're on.
Okay, so I'm representing both the Friends of Lordship Wreck, which is a large open area, a park just next to the Broadwater Farm Estate in Tottenham, and I'm also the convener of the Haringey Rivers Forum. So this is an impressive map of Haringey's rivers, which of course, if you've ever been to Haringey, you will realise are, with the exception of the New River, which is the middle blue, light blue stripe going from north to south, are mostly invisible. So there's an irony in having a rivers forum in our borough, because our rivers are all essentially underground. They're all in culverts. There are minor variations on that. So I'm going to say something briefly about our main river, the Moselle Brook. So this map from left to right is roughly speaking west to east. And so the dark blue stream, which has the collection of tributaries on the left-hand side of the picture, that's sort of roughly speaking between Highgate and Muswell Hill. We're considering that there may be another tributary which comes down the south slope of Alexandra Palace, which is between Muswell Hill and Wood Green. And as you then move east, if you can see, there's a point when it refers to the Moselle Brook, an open space beneath it, midway down towards the River Lee in the east. And there's an open space there. That is Lord Shipwreck, whose friends group I'm representing. And that is where 400 meters of the Moselle is now naturalized across an open space. As you then get to the east, you can see Carbuncle Ditch, the Moselle Brook New Cut, and a further dark blue stream. Those, I suppose, are technically distributaries. They're the point where the Moselle splits into three. It enters the channel that's come south from Pimsbrook in Enfield, and in the bottom one, the unnamed distributary, that comes out straight into the River Lee at Markfield Park. So that's the sort of brook I'm representing. I suppose this is what I've called an upbeat and a downbeat tale. So my community perspective is in a sense not that of people happily tripping around in waders or organising Saturday morning sort of river dipping with school children. It's of people who have the utopian idea that Haringey's rivers should be brought back to the surface. It'll take a long time because it will be deeply disruptive to achieve that. But it's the mission that led us in 2018 to establish the Rivers Forum. So to come back to the community thing, the crucial event in the qualified success in Haringey was the formation of the Lord Shipwreck Users Forum in 2002. That created the conditions which meant that 10 years later, the restoration of the Moselle Brook could go ahead. And I think politically, the fact that this park is co-managed in a partnership between the Lordship Hub Co-op and Haringey Council is quite significant for the story that I'm telling. Now, as I speak, I might have been on a site meeting taking place in Queen's Wood in Highgate, where the council has put forward what I think is best described as a controversial natural flood management scheme in an ancient wood. Dave's colleagues from the Environment Agency are represented at the meeting. Someone's there from Thames 21. But by and large, the Friends of Queen's Wood have found this a really indigestible proposal. They can't understand the hydrology, and they fear that the scheme will have an extremely disruptive impact. So that's a sort of controversial proposal, which, if you favour the restoration, the idea that the Queen's Wood stream will be restored there is enormously significant. But to be as concerned as the Friends group are about the impact of some of the installations on this old woodland site, that means there's an awful lot of compromises still to be worked out. So let me come back to the qualified success. So Lord Shipwreck in 2002 was in a terrible state. It was formerly a famous, thriving park from the sort of set out in many ways in the 1930s, but it had become underused. It felt lifeless and unsafe, hence the formation of the forum. People were aware that the brook ran hidden underground across the park, and there was a kind of channel imitating the culvert below, which would sometimes collect water. And so bringing back the river was a strong feature in the designs and master planning that went on. People saw a new open channel as offering encouraging walking and cycling by putting bridges and paths across a potential stream. There's the ambition to create wildlife-friendly habitats and the biodiversity by sort of rough grassland. And a partnership came together in unusual circumstances. I mean, Thames 21 were involved in this, the Environment Agency, and part of the reason was that in order to build the Olympic Park in the Lee Valley, a small section of it had to be canalised. And the idea that funds would be transferred to open up a brook in the catchment, somewhere in the Lee Valley catchment, somewhere else, drew heritage lottery funding. I think it was a very complex piece of work, and I wasn't around at the time and don't know the details. So what's happened is that an open pond was installed at the west end of the channel. There's a meandering channel, wide sloping sides. It's about 400 meters. It was designed because it was recognized that the water would be polluted, although not as polluted as it did in fact turn out to be. A lot of thought was put into these sort of bridges and sort of paths that circle around the water to give people the maximum chance to look at the natural environment as the water came back. The inflow pond at the start was designed to catch silt, and it did indeed turn out to be substantial and built up very heavily. Planting scheme to attract wildlife along the water's edge, the banks, the surrounding meadow, and most of the brook is diverted into this open channel. There is an overflow culvert that's been retained so that sort of to bypass it. I don't quite know the theory of that. More might have been done, I think, to hold water on the surface of the park. And it was agreed that Haringey themselves and Thames Water would obviously intensify efforts to find misconnections, because coliforms and E. coli were quite a significant factor in the pollution that was entering the wreck. So how it looks now, on the left there, you can see the yellow flag, which is extraordinarily busy with bees every summer. The vegetation has probably got over dense along the channel, but it does also support this kind of, the river does flow through a rough grassland, and that is a highlight of it as well. On the other hand, as you can see on the right, this photograph is probably a year old. There's a lot of sewage fungus, and that is a problem that has not really yet gone away. So the negatives are that the Halcrow, who did the installation, they sort of set up a management plan, but it wasn't implemented for 8 years. And the Friends group in the park needed to apply a lot of pressure on the borough, who are the riparian owners, to achieve ad hoc actions from time to time and carry out informal clearance work themselves. Haringey hasn't wanted to encourage formal volunteering in the area. The water quality didn't improve during most of that time. It was smelly, the silt built up, the appearance wasn't good, algal blooms, and that did discourage any development of volunteer input. And it led to a political climate where the Moselle was openly referred to as a sewer, as if it were part of the foul water system. Alongside that, despite those setbacks, the last 20 years have seen a considerable increase in park usage. People walk there, they cycle there. There's an increasingly wide range of habitats, flowers and butterflies thriving. And as Caroline reports, the Facebook site gets a lot of attention. People do go and visit the brook now. So the recent progress is good in that finally in 2019, sort of 6 or 7 years after it was identified, Haringey did fix this misconnection in Wood Green. It was a primary school that had 75 appliances, including its full toilet system, discharging sewage into the surface water system. And it was widely believed that that was the main source of pollution and contaminants coming into the Moselle in the wreck. Now, whether that's wholly true, we're now less sure. And in fact, one of the problems is that there just isn't the energy and effort going into monitoring and analysing what's happened that there needs to be. The management contract was set up with Ebbsford Environmental and started, it's a 3-year contract, and it started in February 2020. So the Friends are now sort of liaising to understand better how the flow works and to define appropriate input from the Parks Department and from Friends and from a team that we're in the process of setting up at the Haringey Rivers Forum. There's been this summer quite dramatically good news. I mean, it's obviously a testing that we want to see repeated, but there are signs that the water quality has improved considerably. So it may be that finally the effects of reconnecting properly the sewage systems from Alexandra Primary School in Wood Green are beginning to have an effect. I think it's taken longer than people popularly thought it would. So the priorities we have are to improve the water testing and analysis. We need to get better surveying of biodiversity, and sort of, focus the maintenance regime. And we need to develop quality roles for volunteers in all these areas. And so, in that sense, we need to help Haringey overcome a sort of inhibition that there is somehow a major public health issue with the condition of the river. So future prospects, why is this stuck? And I'm looking back here to some of the issues that Dave raised in his presentation about the kind of plateauing of restoration projects. I think the scheme I've just described in Lordship Wreck will be one of the 8 that Dave identified in his presentation. So the first thing is to say there's a lack of political leadership. I mean, my councillors that you talk to, sort of identify river restoration in the borough with all its many challenges and problems as a niche issue. So in not accepting that, we have to be sensible of the priorities that the council has to make. So when we set up Haringey Rivers Forum in 2018, we did it partly to take the weight off Lordship Wreck. So they weren't trying to fight this battle about the misconnected plumbing all on their own. And we had, Haringey had fortunately appointed an extremely tenacious and resourceful drainage technician who did a fantastic diagnostic job and came up with a solution that meant that the problem was actually solved by 2 guys with a digger in a fortnight. And so somewhat shaming that 7 years had passed without the work actually getting done. The second issue, and this I suppose I would call our qualified failure, is that there was an opportunity to do a restoration that would have been on Dave's list, which was on the site of the old Wood Green Gasworks, just to the right of the Edinburgh Railway line as it's come between Hornsey and Alexandra Palace stations, where the development, National Grid, now it's part of Berkeley Homes, there is still the opportunity to deculvert 100 or so meters of the Moselle at a critical point in its evolution. And basically the developers didn't want to deculvert it. They thought it would be too polluted and off-putting to incoming residents. For a long time, we've been told it was too deep, that it couldn't be engineered. All that turned out to be misinformation. And so we did at the planning committee in the beginning of 2018 secure an agreement from Haringey that the developers had to produce a plan, but it was then accepted that a good standard under the bathing water directive was required in order to bring the culverted Moselle back to the surface. Now, the Moselle is amazingly several times in the subsequent testing over the years has actually achieved good bathing water directive standard, but not across enough tests to qualify under the contractual arrangement that the developers made. So looking briefly, I can see Neil needing me to finish. The issue has shifted over the last 2 or 3 years in the borough from misconnections and this, sort of partly real concern about public health, but exaggerated concern about public health, to road runoff and urban biodiversity, which I think is a much more complex issue to tackle. It's not just about getting homeowners to put their plumbing correct, get their plumbing sorted out. It's a major structural issue that we challenge that everyone from engineers through to planners faces. And so we're arguing that the blue ribbon goals for the whole Thames Basin means that Haringey has to balance its responsibilities for planning, which includes carbon reduction, water quality, flood risk, habitat restoration, and biodiversity at local level. So the worry is that in Queen's Wood, what I would call the flood risk tail, particularly after July the 12th this summer, is currently wagging the restoration dog. and that we really need both questions to stand with equal importance. Lastly, there's an overcautious approach to community stakeholders. We could be partners within the London Lee Catchment Partnership, looking back at what Petra's described, but as yet, there seems to be an inhibitedness about giving community organised voices and advocates a proper seat at the table there. So things are, in hand, they're developing. We have an ambitious conversation going, but much more could be done. And delighted to have been asked to present here. And I feel what I'm saying fits very sort of, actually, it may be gritty, but it fits, I hope, very constructively into what we've heard already and what we're going to hear from Ian in the altogether better endowed rivers of Enfield. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for an excellent insight into community engagement, community views, and the critical role that community groups can play actually in getting things moving in quite difficult circumstances. That's fantastic. We now have, as John's indicated, a presentation from Enfield. Sadly, Jamie Kukadia, who was due to be giving this presentation, has fallen ill, so that's disappointing. But we have Ian Russell, her boss, who's going to be standing in for Jamie and giving an overview of how Enfield approaches this issue of restoring London's rivers. Ian, I noticed that your name is being recorded as Dave Webb. I just want to confirm that you're not actually Dave Webb, you're Ian Russell.
No, I think that maybe that's because I clicked on the same link that you sent Dave.
No problem. But over to you. And if you could whip through this as swiftly as you can, Ian, then that will leave us some time for questions. Brilliant. Thank you.
I'll try to do that. Absolutely. So, thanks, Neil and John, for a great segue into my presentation. So, as John said, Enfield is better endowed probably than Harringay. It's actually the borough just to the north of Harringay. Most of the rivers in Enfield are open, as you can see from this map. The ones that are culverted are highlighted by these dotted lines. So you can still got our fair share of culverts, but we've got a lot of urban rivers as well. Having said that, a lot of those are channelized and hidden away, and they also suffer from a lot of the problems that John mentioned, especially arising from diffuse urban pollution, such as misconnections and road runoff and so on. So for that reason, a lot of the rivers in Enfield probably aren't valued as highly as they could be. Broadly speaking, they run from the west of the borough over to the east. The main ones are Turkey Brook, Salmons and Pims, and they all flow over to the River Lee, which forms the eastern boundary of Enfield. There's a lot of flood risk associated with those rivers. You can see it's concentrated in the east and especially in the southeast of the borough. There's also a lot of problems. This is a horrific culvert where, for whatever reason, just a lot of, it's next to a main road probably is the main reason, but it's a lot of rubbish tends to accumulate in there. It's very difficult to clean as well, so it tends to stay there for a long time. This is an outfall showing sewage fungus, which again, we see all over the place. And we do work with Thames Water on a regular basis trying to eliminate the source of this pollution. But, I think there's an estimate that somewhere between 5 and 10% of all the properties in North London have some kind of misconnection. So you're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of properties, whereas over the last, say, 5 or 6 years, we've maybe eliminated a few hundred, but we're really only scratching the surface of the problem. Here's some more sewage fungus for you to look at. Anyway, I'll move on swiftly. So one of the ways we try and address these problems in Enfield is by using constructed wetlands to try and both attenuate flows. So they're basically big suds features. They capture water during extreme rainfall events to slow it down. But they're also great at treating pollution as well. But really what I was going to focus on today, obviously, was some river restoration projects we've got going on in the borough. So these are 3 live projects. The one at Meridian Water is kind of development led. But first I'm going to mention Albany Park and Sam's Brook. So Albany Park is a very urbanised location. Having said that, it's a big park. It's about 10 hectares in size. It's by far the biggest park in this area. There's about 25,000 people that live within a kilometre of it. And there are about 9 schools within a kilometre as well. The genesis of this project actually goes back to around 2014, when we asked the local friends group, how would you like to see your park being improved? And one of the main things they said was to improve the river. The river at the time looked like this. It's it ran in this channel along the northern boundary of the park. So when you were standing almost anywhere in the park, you couldn't see the river, and most people didn't even really appreciate that it was a proper river. They almost called it a sewer, and it did have a lot of rubbish in it, and it did have a fair bit of pollution as well. So we came up with a concept of naturalizing the river, basically by bringing it into, basically by carving out a huge swathe through the park, bringing the river in to that space and enabling people to access it from both sides. We've also introduced quite a few wetland features around the south side as well. So that's where there's a surface sort of sewer down here that we've diverted into the wetland. So again, that's helping to, slow the water down and treat it before it actually gets to the river. So that's what it looked like before. This is what it looks like now. Hopefully you'll appreciate that's a big improvement in just visually. I mean, it's we've had huge positive feedback from members of the public. This scheme was only finished. I mean, it's not even really finished yet. We had a launch event a couple of weeks ago, and we've got a Love the Lee event there with Thames 21 this Friday. But we're really it's only the actual contractors are still on site finishing off some bits and bobs. They were on site for about a year. It was a big project. Have to say, it was primarily funded by the Environment Agency due to the flood risk management benefits. And this is one of the key challenges of river restoration, is actually getting the money to do it in the first place. This project cost £1.6 million. We've moved a huge amount of earth, and that's because the river itself was 3.5 meters deep. So to get it into the park and create these beautiful sort of natural features, meanders and beaches and berms and so on, we had to shift a lot of soil. We also had to move a gas main and high voltage electricity cables and various other things. But as I say, what really made it work was that we were able to deliver significant flood risk benefit as well. And the way we did that was that all the material that came out of the channel here was deposited on the south side of the park and around the edges as well. So we basically converted the whole park into a flood storage area, and that protects over 400 local properties from flooding. So as I say, the Environment Agency paid the lion's share of that funding. We also got a significant grant from the Mayor of London, GLA, and we've had a fair bit of money from Inflow Council itself as well. Right, I'm going to move on to Salmon's Brook, which is in a completely different type of location. So this is in the Greenbelt, the very rural part of Enfield in the northwest of the borough. But actually, if you recall the map I showed at the start, the main source or the main area at risk of flooding in Enfield is in the southeast, and it's on the Salmons Brook. So we commenced a natural flood management project about 3 or 4 years ago, working with Thames 21, who we work with on a lot of our river projects, to look at what measures we could implement on the Salmons Brook that would help to reduce flood risk downstream and achieve other benefits like improving biodiversity, creating habitat, and improving the location for people as well. But one thing that's quite striking about Salmons Brook is as it runs through this area, which is predominantly farmland, you can see here it's kind of straight, then it's got a kink, then it's straight, kink, straight, kink, straight. And actually, even if we look back at the maps from 1867, which are the oldest kind of detailed maps that we've got of Enfield, the river was in that state even then, but we've got older maps that indicate that it was much more naturalized if you go back a bit further. And essentially what we can see there is the river has been engineered, even in this rural location, it's been very heavily engineered, it's been dredged, it's been deepened and straightened over more than a century. And what that means is that it's a very effective channel for getting rid of water very quickly. So when we've done hydraulic modeling for this location, we can see that even for a 1 in 100 year flood event, there's very little flooding here, almost no flooding at all here, because the channel's so deep that it's shoving all the water downstream. The other things that contribute to that rate of runoff are the fact that all these farmers tend to have quite a lot of land drainage. They've all got very effective ditches that will send the water shooting downstream as well. So although we're keen to naturalise this river, one of the first things we started to do was to think about taking the catchment-based approach to doing this. So actually restoring some of the landscape as a more natural landscape. So this is a map that indicates the woodland creation project that we kicked off last year. So the area highlighted yellow is a new sort of swathe of publicly accessible woodland that follows the route of the London Loop footpath. But as you can see, a large chunk of it follows the Salmons Brook itself. And what by taking some of this land out of agricultural use, we're able to naturalize, that basically makes it easier for us to naturalize the river, which we haven't got around to doing yet, but we're kind of setting the scene for that. But planting trees helps to create these vegetated buffer strips between the farmland and the river itself, so slowing the flow, capturing pollution and so on. Another way that we're doing that is by aiming to put in lots and lots of what we're calling kind of rural suds, but they're basically small ponds and wetlands that will look something like this photograph on the left here. This is one we did in Trent Park about 2 years ago, but as you can see from the map, we've identified lots and lots of other locations where we could potentially put more of these features in. And again, it's all about slowing the flow, cleaning it, etc. The green ones are the ones we've already done. The orange and the purple ones are the ones we're hoping to do in the future. But I doubt if we'll ever quite get all of these done. But if we can get sort of halfway there, we'll be achieving a lot. At that point, we then start to think about what can we do with the channel itself. And this year we've appointed a consultant at CBEC to work with us on Stage 0 river restoration. And Stage 0 is a process-based approach to restoring rivers. It's typically associated with depositional river systems, which this doesn't quite fit that classification. So we're taking the Stage 0 approach a little bit flexibly. But I guess the key principle of it really is that you're seeking to restore the river back to a state that a state similar to what it would have been in before humans got involved. So that could be a multi-threaded channel, much nearer the surface, very shallow, probably with lots of linked wetlands and ponds and so on. So we're working with this consultant and with the Environment Agency as well this year to basically deliver a feasibility study which will look at how, what the benefits of this approach would be and actually how we could achieve it. And the sort of measures that we're likely to be implementing will be, filling the channel with woody debris, maybe even filling it with material to basically bring it back nearer the surface and bring the water table nearer the surface. But a little bit further down the line, what we'd really like to consider is actually reintroducing beavers to this location, because that could ultimately be the best way of achieving the habitat creation elements that we want to see, but also restoring the river back to the sort of state that we want to see. And of course, the good thing about beavers as well is that they will help to maintain that environment themselves with reduced intervention from us. And in many ways, given that we face similar problems as Haringey and other boroughs in terms of actually managing these sites, that the less intervention we need from us in the future, the better. So that's the last slide. Neil, I'll draw it to a close there.
Thank you. Excellent. Very rapid overview of some fantastic work that's going on in
Sorry, I don't know how much you wanted me to rush through it. But,
it's fantastic. I think basically we've had a fantastic set of presentations, a very wide-ranging set of presentations. Really only enough to give a taster, really, I think, to you all of what's happened over recent years and what the potential is for future years in terms of restoring London's rivers and watercourses. And we've heard finally there from Enfield Borough, which is very much, I think, leading the way amongst London boroughs in terms of addressing this challenge, which is going to become only more important as climate change effects are increasingly felt. We've got a bit of time for questions and discussion. So, and thank you to everyone who has posted some questions in the Q&A panel. Before we get to them, I've just pasted in the chat a bit of promo around other events that CPRE London is organising during London Rivers Week this week. We've got an evening webinar, London Rivers Week Book Club, that is taking place tomorrow evening with authors Lara Maitland, Tom Chivers and Tom Bolton, who some of you will know. That will be an interesting discussion about the personal and cultural importance of rivers and waterways. And if you're quick, you might be able to snap a ticket for a water-based litter pick that we're organising up in Hackney with Leaside Canoes on Sunday afternoon. That's enough of a commercial break. So let's get to the questions. We've had a couple of early questions, I think, aimed particularly at you, Dave, in terms of the opportunities map that you showed at the end of your presentation. how people can get a hold of that, and is there a list of sites, Cynthia Jenkins asks, of the opportunities that were shown on your map? Can we share that?
Yeah, that should be fine. So the map itself is based from a table, so that would give you the list of sites and the grid references. So yeah, that would be a problem sharing that. So if you can get the details, I can forward that table to you, Neil, through if that's possible to send. So the map itself, it is on the website, but we are going to have continued dialogue with Giggle to look at how that map is going to work, because at the moment it is just really that those lists of sites and the potential to use it with other data sets, whether it's areas of deficiency, potential areas for natural flood management. There is a wider conversation to be had to be able to really start using that data to really start pinpointing what are the benefits that can be derived from opportunities at specific locations. So it's very much the first step in something which we want to be able to use as a kind of very much a decision-making tool for land managers, but also for areas such as biodiversity net gain, which potentially is going to be an increasingly important aspect in attracting that investment, which is so dearly needed. Great.
Thank you, Dave. I don't know if any of the other speakers want to chip in on that question, but we have, if not, we have a couple of more questions. One perhaps for you, Matthew, or indeed anyone who feels able to respond to this. Philip Alford is asking, is there an agreed definition of what is considered to be a wetland, e.g. a scrape versus a pond? Is this something that the Wildlife Trusts have grappled with, Matthew?
I don't think we spend too much time. Arguably, when I referred to the kind of context of the old London Biodiversity Action Plan, there were countless meetings trying to define what was the difference between a fen, a mire, a swamp, a marsh. There are very complex hydrologies in the natural world. We would basically say anything which was, for a start, anything that's permanently wet is clearly a wetland. But there are also temporary wetlands as well. So scrapes can become inundated with water, either through natural rainfall or permeating up to the surface during particularly wet conditions, and they may dry out in the summer. And there is a whole range of biodiversity that adapts to that particular situation. So I don't think there's a kind of quick one-liner, but basically anything that is wet for all or some of the year.
Great, Matthew. Thanks, Matthew. Ian, I don't know whether your SUDs or sustainable urban drainage schemes would classify as wetlands or scrapes, or does it really not matter to you? How often during the year do you expect these SUDs to be wet as opposed to dry?
Yeah, I think I would call the rain gardens like mini wetlands, even though they're dry most of the time, because the thing is, as SUDS features, they have to empty within a certain time because they need to be ready for the next storm event. So generally, the sort of common standard is they need to be half empty within 24 hours. So that means they drain very well. So actually, when we're planting them up, you've got to think about plants that can tolerate dry conditions as well as wet conditions. But yeah, I would still call them wetlands, even though they're very small and dry for a lot of the time. So yeah, but like Matthew, I think we wouldn't be too strict about it. Yeah. Great,
thank you. Other speakers, do please chip in or wave your hand around if you want to contribute. We've got a question posted, an interesting question, perhaps another one for you, Ian, and possibly Matthew, posted in the chat here about, I think slightly tongue-in-cheek. I notice you've ruled out introducing wolves and bears at Salmon's Brook. But could you say more about the plans for beavers and cattle?
Yes.
And are you paying any attention to what's going on down in Sussex at Knepp, which I don't think is a particularly wet landscape, but nonetheless maybe lessons to be learned?
Yeah, so a couple of years ago we went to visit NEP, and last year we managed to get a load of our senior managers to go and visit as well, which is great. I mean, that's one of the reasons we've been able to achieve a lot at Enfield is because we've got support from our chief executive and director for environment and so on. And we are looking at the potential for a larger scale rewilding opportunities within that greenbelt area of Enfield. Not to say that we're looking to eliminate farming completely, but we're looking at whether we can have a different type of farming. It could be closer to that kind of NEP model. We're also taking inspiration from places like Epping Forest, where they've got free grazing cattle. They've got longhorn cattle like the ones at NEP. They've got a fairly small herd given the size of Epping Forest, but I think this is the key thing. It's about having, you know, the right animal kind of at the right density. And they use some really interesting innovative technologies at Epping Forest. They've got cattle with GPS collars, so they can monitor where the cattle go, and they can also control where the cattle go, because they can kind of draw a box on a computer screen and create a kind of an invisible electric fence. So if the animal crosses that line, then it sets off a beep, and if they cross it, if they go any further, then it actually gives them an electric shock. So there's things like that that we are considering. We're not quite getting there yet, but we're just at that kind of early sort of feasibility. In terms of the beavers, though, we have progressed further with that, because we've got a site where we're looking to reintroduce beavers, hopefully later this year, or if not early next year. And we're doing that in partnership with Capel Manor College. So Capel Manor run 40 Hall Farm, which is one of Enfield's, they lease it from Enfield, and we're looking to do it within that site. At the moment, we're still doing, it'll be within an enclosure. So it's a fairly small site, and it's just one family of beavers. But we see this as a sort of stepping stone towards, hopefully, or potentially, wider reintroduction of beavers within that rural area of Enfield a bit further down the line. But yeah, it's exciting stuff. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Ian. Matthew, you've obviously got a perspective on rewilding more broadly.
Yes, I mean, I think as Ian has already mentioned in his presentation, I think it's about stepping stone, you know, because rewilding is a widely banded around term now, to the extent that it can mean everything for everybody. And we're slightly nervous about the kind of taking the kind of top line predators and just introducing them into a landscape and expecting everything to go fantastic. It's not going to work like that. We're similarly taking a look on the River Crane. We managed some land, on the River Colne in far west London, on the borders with Buckinghamshire. We managed some land there, and we've been looking at potential beaver introduction, but it will be an enclosure at this moment in time, in the same way that Kent Wildlife Trust did at Hand Fen, as a management tool, really, rather than focusing on, hey, just bring a big road and put it back into London, because we know there's a lot of interest around this. But we need to be very mindful, I think, as Ian has implicitly said, is getting clear about what the purpose is, testing the viability before going too far. We already grazed those sites on a conservation grazing regime. And we've also been doing some work with other partners in the Colne Valley on the potential for expanding conservation grazing regime on many other sites, just to, you know, slowly turn land into a much more natural state where we can. Again, there's significant barriers in the Colne Valley, significant pressures with HS2 and Heathrow, etc. It's also turned kind of edge territory, bandit territory, so there's a lot of fairly unregulated industries going on there as well. But, you know, there's scope, and there's a lot of interest, and as Ian said, you know, NEP is an inspiration. And I also say that it was a lot of waterlogging of the previous dairy farming that turned the land, I can't remember the name now, but to investigate a different way of managing the land. So water, when it's bad, is often a trigger to look at a different way of working with it.
Thanks, Matthew. So I'm conscious of time. We've got 5 or so minutes left before we have to wrap up. There are some questions around the issue of sewage and the the recent controversies around the Environment Bill, which some of you may have picked up from the media and social media, where attempts are being made to amend the Environment Bill to impose stricter requirements on water companies to do more to control sewage. Well, we'll come back to that question perhaps as a final one for everyone to answer. Give us your thoughts on that quite controversial, very topical issue. But before doing that, there's another question from Philip Alford about a more specific question about, is there a common baseline for water quality / chemical tests used in river restoration? I don't know who might be best to. I mean, John, you touched on this a bit, and I think maybe Petra, you would have something to say on this, and Dave possibly too. John, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, it's a very pertinent question. I mean, obviously, Haringey is different from Enfield in that it is, you know, a more heavily urbanised area. And we asked Sarah Bell from the Engineering Exchange at University College London to try and answer exactly that question, given that we were faced with the Bathing Water Directive, which everybody from CWEM onwards was clear was completely inappropriate. It then didn't prove very easy, even with an international desktop study, to say what kind of what sort of balance are you looking at? What level of pollution is tolerable? Yeah. And but she, her advice, broadly speaking, was that is a workable project. And I think if we're going to tackle the sort of political cautiousness around this, particularly in inner London, we're going to need further work on that kind of data. And the Camellia Research Initiative, with UCL and Oxford and British Geological Survey and Imperial, is really the place to progress that.
Thank you very much. I don't know if anyone else wants to chip in on that question, or shall we just end up with your kind of final thoughts, each of you, on this perhaps overarching question of sewage discharge and what can be done about it? Miles Bell, I think, puts it well. Obviously a lot of the debate at the moment is about legislation and changing the statutory framework in connection with the Environment Bill and the powers of the new Environmental Protection Agency. But Miles is saying, well, whilst there's a lot of hubbub around sewage and rivers at the moment and how much it might cost to reduce outflows, what are your top cheapish interventions to reduce the impact of sewage? So maybe we can have one line from each presenter in response to that question. Dave, do you want to kick off?
Yeah. Oh my goodness, it's very difficult to have it in one line. But okay. So I think the issue is that I think if you look at the DEFRA's environment plan, there is aspirations to improve water quality. I think the concern for many people is it going fast enough and is enough being done, and certainly part of the debate that we're having, we're more focused on river restoration. It's all about getting that investment, because clearly the investment hasn't kept up. The investment in rivers and infrastructure hasn't kept up with the growth and climate change pressures. So there is really an increased feeling of urgency. I think the part of the issue as well, and I kind of reflect some bit of what John's experience very much when I started working on rivers in the late 80s in London. They were very much seen as environmental hazards, and people were actively discouraged from interacting. And actually you had a circle of decline in that lack of engagement and getting people involved in rivers actually made things worse. And it's a very hot political question. I haven't got a clear answer, but certainly community engagement and reflecting on the importance of our rivers, both as environmental features and cultural assets, that is certainly an important aspect to actually trying to get things done quicker.
Great, thanks, Dave. So going through in order of presentations, Matthew, do you want to go next quickly? Just got a couple of minutes, really.
Yeah, I'll just be very quick, really. I mean, the first thing is tackling it at source, which at the end of the day requires a massive public awareness program without trying to sound, dare I say it, paternalistic or directive. You know, it's about raising awareness and providing measures, you know, and it then goes into connections and, you know, the whole kind of plumbing and servicing industry. And then there's the thing that we, you know, land managers can do about just implementing a wider scale of SUDS interventions to deal with the surface water and when the sewage system can't cope. You know, the issue about the vote, I'm being very, you know, I can understand the anger, but the cost of actually addressing the drainage system, the sewage system in cities is going to be phenomenal.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Petra, your one line on
this. It is a difficult question and definitely extremely complex. So we've been involved in several rounds of outfall safaris where volunteers were recording polluting outfalls on rivers, including rag, that is like a solid stuff that gets left over by sewage. And it is complicated. First, it is establishing that mental connection between what we flush down the toilet and what eventually ends up in our rivers. But also there needs to be a system that incentivizes water companies to invest in their infrastructure, because that system is broken at the moment with a price review system that's very limiting and maybe focusing on some other outcomes. Yes, and I think there are other sources of pollution that are becoming more and more obvious, like chemicals and plastics that are their sources, road runoff and chemicals we're using in everyday products, which are now causing some of our rivers, once they're starting to be monitored, to fail on Water Framework Directive. So it's not that simple.
No, but as you say, I mean, hopefully the political controversy at the moment will draw attention to proper solutions to this problem. John, and then Ian to finish up. John, you drew attention to the positive effect of solving the misconnection in the primary school in Lordship Rec. Are there more opportunities like that?
Yeah, I think so. But ultimately, there has to be public pressure on politicians and corporations, which I agree with Matthew, means education. And we have to learn to care about drains and water below ground and its long-term effects, as we cared about many other things. And we're a long way off that.
Thank you very much. And finally, Ian.
Yeah, so I was going to reiterate, yeah, more SUDS to take pressure off the system, but also more effective monitoring. I mean, it's great that, you know, volunteers and friends groups and people do citizen science and so on. That's fantastic. But really, the Environment Agency ultimately need more resources to actually monitor this stuff effectively. And that, again, comes back to politicians and government.
Right. Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone. I've noticed we've gone a few minutes over, but I think it was justified by the importance of that final question. Thank you to all attendees for the questions and for your attentiveness, and thank you in particular to all of the wonderful presenters that we've heard from this afternoon. It's been a really interesting session. Please keep a lookout for the recording on the YouTube channel if you want to dip in and listen again. But otherwise, join some other London Rivers Week events. Go to the Thames 21 website or the CPRE London website to sign up. I hope to see you at some point in the near future. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thank you.
Cheers.